guys, and welcome back to my channel. If you've not been here before, this is Cruel Intentions, a true crime channel, and I am Holly, and every week I take you on a journey throughout Australian true crime history. Thank you so much for being here for episode 3. So today we're diving into the case of Eric Edgar Cooke, aka the Nightcaller, aka the Nedlands Monster, who terrorised the city of Perth in the late 50s and early 60s. This one is big, guys. This case involves wrongful conviction and imprisonment, police cover-ups, coerced confessions, and lives that have been literally destroyed by not only Cooke, but also by the police at the time that seemed far more concerned with keeping their jobs and making themselves look good than by actually doing the right thing. Now, Cooke was a special sort of serial killer. He killed whoever, wherever, and for whatever. It made it really difficult to find a pattern. His victims were completely random. He had no set MO, and the authorities were pretty sure it was only one person committing most of the murders and attempted murders in Perth at the time, but they had no idea why or who it was. Some of his victims were stabbed with knives or scissors, some were hit by vehicles, some were shot with a rifle, one was strangled, one was mutilated with a tomahawk. There was literally no rhyme or reason to Cooke's victim selection or method of murder. The terrified city of Perth was saved from this mysterious killer through sheer luck and a very observant elderly couple. So, let's just jump right in. Early 1960s Perth was obviously a very different place to what it is now. Back then, it was considered a big country town with a population of under 500,000. Today, Perth is one of Australia's largest cities with almost 2 million residents. But back then it was the kind of town where you left your house unlocked, the doors and windows wide open to catch a breeze on warm days. It was hot most of the time, so sleeping outdoors or on the veranda was super common. You left the keys in the car, you left the milk bottles outside with the milk money in them, and you never thought about anything being stolen. That was until Eric Edgar Cooke started his violent serial murders. Eric Edgar Cooke was born on the 25th of February 1931 in Victoria Park in Perth. He was born with a cleft lip and cleft palate, which is where the lip and mouth haven't formed properly during pregnancy and they create an opening or split in the upper lip and the roof of the mouth. His father, Vivian Thomas Cooke, immediately regarded the baby as deformed and outwardly despised his disfigured son from almost the moment of his birth. Vivian Cooke was a fitter and turner at a Perth engineering company and had met his future wife Christine Edgar in the late 1920s. Christine fell pregnant fairly quickly, and it was the 20s, so the proper thing to do at the time was to get married. Vivian hadn't wanted to marry Christine, he had just been after some fun, but the circumstances of the time that they were living in called for it, so reluctantly he got hitched. Now Vivian did not care at all about having a wife and family. All he cared about was drinking. His father before him had been an abusive alcoholic, and Vivian followed all too closely in his own father's footsteps. Christine was the recipient of Vivian's violent alcohol-fueled rages. He often went straight to the pub after work and came home with a temper, and he took it out physically on his wife. Eric was the child that Christine had been pregnant with when she convinced Vivian to marry her, and even through Vivian's obvious hatred for their first child, she went on to have another 2 children, both daughters, to the same man. They would sadly just become more targets for Vivian's abuse and rage instead of the saviours of the marriage and family as Christine may have intended. At 3 months old, Eric Edgar Cooke had his first surgery to try and correct his facial deformities, but it did very little to help. Another 3 years later, he had another operation to try and correct the orofacial clefts, but again, there wasn't much in the way of improvement. Nowadays, palatoplasty, orthodontic surgery, bone grafting, flap surgery, and dental implants are commonly used to treat this birth defect. But 80 plus years ago, there wasn't much to be done. Cooke grew up with a large speech impediment, and he was said to mumble, even after his mother Christine sent him to many years of speech therapy. Christine was a loving and caring mother. When Cooke was often teased and tormented by other kids in school, she would shower him with loving words and affection. He was her only son, and she adored him. Vivian, however, not being able to stand the sight of his son, used only violence and abuse to deal with him. Cooke would often run in front of his mother when she was being beaten by his father, and this caused Vivian to lash out at the boy. After all, in Vivian's mind, he was the man of the house, and how dare his child interfere with how he dealt with his own wife? Christine said that Vivian would often beat the boy with belts or sticks or his bare fists, often aiming at his head, and later in life Cooke would actually suffer from blackouts. One incident that Christine remembers was when Vivian had accused Eric of something, she didn't remember what. Vivian was drunk, and Eric had denied whatever it was, when Vivian beat him in the head with his fists, and Eric's temple hit a light switch on the wall between the kitchen and dining rooms. He required hospitalization, and his skull was fractured. Eric Edgar Cooke was often presenting at the emergency department with head injuries. It was suspected that he'd even developed brain damage from repeated head trauma. Cooke attended Subiaco State School until the age of 6, when he was expelled from stealing money from a teacher's purse. Vivian had a habit of spending his wages at the pub, and often the family was without money to spend on food and necessities, so Eric would steal it. He was transferred to Newcastle Street Infant School, but was mercilessly bullied. He changed primary schools often due to this, and attended Highgate Primary School and Perth Junior Technical before enrolling in Forest High School. Cooke left school when he was only 14, due to the family not being able to afford things like food. Vivian had continued to spend their money on alcohol, and his mother earned a measly wage from cooking and cleaning for other families, but it wasn't enough to keep up a household. He took up work making deliveries for the Central Provision stores, and at this time he also joined the Scarborough Junior Surf Lifesaving Club, and he relished in the opportunity to make friends. He wanted to impress his peers, wanted to earn their respect, or at least he wanted to make it seem like that. In the clubhouse one day, he stole a watch, and he went to a key cutter to have it engraved to make it look like a sign of admiration from the club. He had it inscribed with "To Cookie from the boys at the SJSLC. Maybe he did it to try and impress his father, or maybe he had just wanted something that made it look like he was valued. But of course, soon after he'd stolen it, it was missed by the owner, and he was quickly found to have been the one to have stolen it. He was asked to leave the club, not only because of this, but also because his blackouts and clumsiness really hadn't helped him in the pursuit of being a lifeguard. He'd regularly had to be rescued from the waves and rips himself. Cooke then moved up to semi-skilled labour work. He worked on the floor of the Harris Scarf and Sandover warehouse, where hardware was produced, but due to being accident-prone and suffering from the blackouts, he was often hurt while working. At the factory, he was sent to hospital when a winch hit him in the face, and it was only a couple of months after that that he was back in hospital, this time for the fractured skull that Christine had spoken about. At 16, he started working in the blacksmith department at the Midland Junction Rail Depot. He injured both of his hands, and he burnt his face in steam, resulting in second-degree burns. Cooke spent as much time away from his home as he possibly could, trying to avoid his father's rage and abuse and violence. It's reported that he often hid and slept underneath his house just to avoid going inside, and he would often roam the streets at night. As he roamed, he also found a way to make a few extra dollars here and there, breaking and entering. It was easy at the time. Most houses were unlocked, or the doors and windows were just wide open. He could literally walk in, take what he wanted, and walk straight back out again. He started to also enjoy his nighttime strolls because he often got the opportunity to watch women through their windows, showering, dressing, or undressing. He started to enjoy the thrill of breaking into houses and soon craved more risk. He began entering residences while the occupants were still home, stealing what he could out of purses and wallets, and then exiting the home without anyone noticing he'd ever been there. He was good at it. He was quiet and small, and he was unassuming, and he used this to his advantage. The break-ins became more regular, and eventually, if he couldn't find enough cash or valuables, he'd start lashing out. He'd damage the furniture or set fire to the house. He'd cut up the clothing in the wardrobe or slash the curtains. At the age of 17, in 1948, Cooke joined the CMF, or Citizen Military Forces, now known as the Army Reserves. He received basic training but still lived a civilian life. But he excelled in marksmanship. He was told that his speech issues would perhaps hinder him from promotion, but soon enough he was promoted to Lance Corporal, and he enjoyed the praise he received from his peers and superiors. He was still keeping up his nighttime thefts and had continued to destroy property and set fires if the urge caught him. The police were starting to notice the increase in criminal activity in the area. They had investigated many of the homes that had been burglarized and had even lifted fingerprints from a few, but they hadn't had any luck in matching any of them. This changed in March of 1949. Cooke, now an expert in breaking and entering without suspicion, broke into the Yelchin home. Ivan Yelchin and his wife heard a noise coming from their bathroom and went to investigate. There they saw Eric Edgar Cooke. Cooke tried to pretend he was a drunken neighbour who'd been confused and had entered their home by mistake, but Ivan was completely unconvinced. When he went to grab Cooke, the teen just ran for it. The Yelchins reported the break-in, and Cooke's face wasn't one you forgot in a hurry, so they were able to give a full description of the stranger. It took police no time at all to track down the young offender. He'd been staying at his grandmother's house. And after fingerprinting him and then matching the prints to the ones at numerous other break-ins, Cooke was arrested and charged with 4 counts of arson, 7 counts of break-and-enter, and 2 counts of theft. 2 months after he was caught and arrested, the 18-year-old Cooke was brought in front of a judge for the first, but definitely not the last time. He had not made any application for bail, knowing that his father 100% would never pay it, and his mother wouldn't have been able to afford it. The Inspector General of Mental Hospitals, Dr. A.J. Thompson, visited with Cooke before sentencing, and said that while he was not certifiably insane and was of normal intelligence, Cooke was emotionally undeveloped, which caused him to be unable to adjust himself in his adolescence to an adult social world. He surmised that most of Cooke's issues had been formed from the cleft lip and palate, which had resulted in social rejection and in his father's hatred and abuse. The arresting officer, Detective Burrows, said that Cooke was one of life's unfortunates, and the judge took this into consideration. The judge believed that Cooke was only stealing to provide for his family, and owing to this and to his troubled home life, he sentenced Cooke to 3 years, but said that a review of the sentence would be given in 3 months. After the 3-month review period, Cooke was released. He still had to spend a month in a mental health unit, but after that he was back on the Perth streets. Now, it seemed like Cooke had turned his life around. He joined the South Perth Methodist Church under the guidance of Reverend John Hawkins. He attended Bible study, he joined the youth group, he attended services, and he admired the Reverend. After all, Reverend John was everything that Cooke had wanted in his own father. He had friends, a social life, he attended events and Bible camp, and he read the Bible, and some reports say he read the Bible so often that his mother worried that maybe he was becoming a fanatic. But Cooke had finally found a group of people who accepted him for exactly who he was, and he loved that. 18 months after joining the church, however, police found Cooke's fingerprints on the money box inside a church official's home. The money box had kept the church donations in it, but it was now completely empty, and Cooke was once again brought before the judge for theft. Despite stealing from them, the church members defended and supported Cooke. He had simply made a mistake. He'd made so much progress, and he should be given another chance. The judge agreed, and Cooke was fined £50, but he was warned that he could not continue this criminal behaviour, Otherwise, he would receive harsher punishments in the future. In 1952, at the age of 21, Cooke joined the permanent military forces after being enlisted in the reserves, and he excelled as a rifleman. But he only served 3 months before the army found out about his convictions for theft, arson and breaking and entering, and he was quickly discharged. He'd now been told that he could no longer participate in the one thing that he had truly mastered. He had been an amazing shot, and he'd been receiving high praise for his gunmanship, and now he was forced to give it up. But in the not too distant future, Cooke would use this ability to the detriment of the Perth community. In early 1953, Cooke found work driving trucks for the West Perth metropolitan markets, and in the market staff canteen he met a 19-year-old woman named Sarah Sally Lavin, who went by Sally. They dated for only 4 months before being married in November of that year, and they would go on to have 7 children, 4 boys and 3 girls. It was everything Sally had dreamed of. Her only want in life was to be married with a large family, and she was happy that she'd found a man to provide her with the many children she'd always dreamt of having. Cooke, though, was back in his habit of prowling the streets at night. Sally didn't like this, but knew that Cooke had done it often as a child, and she just figured it was a hard habit to break, so she accepted it willingly enough. She was aware that her husband was a thief and a peeping Tom, but she was also deeply religious, so leaving her husband was out of the question. She took on the ask no questions and you'll be told no lies outlook, and after all, it wasn't as if he wasn't taking care of his family. Cooke was still paying all the bills and putting food on the table. What she didn't know is that Cooke was continuing his habit of breaking and entering, thefts, and was starting to descend into far more violent crime. In 1955, Cooke stole a car. It was easy at the time. Most cars were left outside, keys in the ignition, ready and waiting for Cooke to come and take it on a joyride. He would drive the car around and then take it back to the owner's house where he'd found it, and no one would know the difference. They wouldn't notice the few extra kilometres on the clock or the minuscule amount of fuel that had been used on his adventures. This time, however, he stole the car and followed a woman on her way to a hockey tournament over 2 hours away in Bunbury. On the way, Cooke's driving became erratic and he rolled the vehicle. He escaped the crash with severe facial injuries, a broken knee and a broken sternum, but was quickly picked up and charged with car theft. He faced the magistrate yet again, and again his South Perth Metropolitan Church congregation were there to support him. One of the members was a lawyer and argued that Cooke was working hard at rehabilitation and that this one-off incident was not representative of what they knew as a hard-working, friendly young man. The lawyer said he deserved another chance, but the magistrate had heard this before and this time did not agree. Even though Cooke's second son had only just been born, he was sentenced to 2 years incarceration and hard labour. It was at this point that people started telling Sally that she should have the marriage annulled, and she flat out refused. She couldn't leave her husband while he was in this predicament. She had hoped that he could be reformed with the prison time that he'd been given. She believed, as the church did, that Cooke deserved a second chance. Cooke was unfortunately displaying the same behaviour as his own father at home, and it was reported that he was highly abusive to both his wife and his male children. But again, this was a different time, where options for women were fewer and further between than they are now. In 1950s Australia, if you got married, you stayed married or you suffered the indecency of being a divorced woman. Now, the couple's friends and the church members knew about the treatment of Cooke's wife, but they still petitioned to have him released early, and it was granted in December of 1956, 3 months earlier than his original release date. The officials thought it would be nice and fair to have Cooke released in time to spend Christmas with his family. For the next couple of years, to all that knew him, it seemed as if the latest prison time had worked on Cooke. He picked up truck driving work again and welcomed the arrival of twin girls. The family was now a total of 6. But he was still out all hours of the night, and Sally figured he was out enjoying himself after a long week's work. She still asked no questions, and if she did, Cooke wouldn't answer them. She suspected that Cooke might be out seeing other women, leaving her home with their 4 children. In the time between his late teens and mid-20s, Cooke's confidence had grown. He didn't seem to be ashamed of his facial deformity or his speech impediment, and he would often go out with single women about town, telling them that he was looking after his brother's widow and his children after his brother had passed away. Of course, Cooke wasn't just going out to play around on his wife. He was continually casing and breaking into homes, watching women through their windows and stealing whatever he could find from unlocked houses, with one major difference. He now wore gloves. He knew that fingerprints had been used to identify him previously, and he was not about to make that same mistake again. So he carried a pair of white gloves with him almost everywhere he went. He would study routines and case houses, but he was also an opportunistic criminal who would, on a whim, try a door or window and would take what he could when he could. He was still keeping his activity relatively non-violent, though. He was a peeping Tom, and he was a prowler and a burglar, but as yet he hadn't attacked anyone. This would change on September the 12th, 1958. In 1958, Cooke was 27, married, a father of 4, and a stalker. He'd gone out that night and stolen a Ford sedan from a quiet street. He'd recently been stalking a young woman and had hoped to watch her again through her window, but that particular night she wasn't home, so he decided to just take the car for a joyride and drop it back later on. He didn't have a plan. He was just driving around when he saw a 26-year-old woman named Nell Schneider. She was riding her bike home from a church choir practice. Something came over Cooke and he followed her, and then all of a sudden he accelerated and aimed right for her. He hit her and the bike and she was thrown into the air. He saw her drop back to the ground and he sped off, carrying her bike still lodged in the front of the car for a few meters before it too flew off and hit the ground. Nell, a mother of 2 young children, was found by a passerby not long after. She was unconscious but alive. She was rushed to hospital suffering a fractured skull and brain damage, and she would also suffer from seizures for the rest of her life. But Nell had no memory of the incident. She remembered riding her bike and then remembered waking up in hospital and nothing in between. She didn't know what had happened and had no idea that she'd been intentionally run down. Cooke had abandoned the Ford in a nearby street and had just walked away. He'd been wearing gloves, so he hadn't left any fingerprints. No one suspected him, no one knew he had been there, and he knew he'd gotten away with it. But this act of senseless violence would be only the start of a downward spiral of assault, brutality, and soon enough, murder. Cooke's next attack would be only 2 months later on the 25th of November 1958. He broke into the bedroom of 15-year-old Molly McLeod, but she had stirred at the sound of the screen door banging closed, and he struck her in the head. It's unknown what he used, but he frequently brought a torch with him on his break-ins, so it may have been that, and he just immediately ran back out the door. Molly staggered and swayed into her parents' bedroom. She was vomiting and bleeding from the head. Her parents, who hadn't heard anything, assumed that she must have had a nightmare and just fallen out of bed. The next day, they took her to the doctor, only to find out that she'd suffered a hairline fracture in her skull. But no one even knew that she'd been attacked, so it was never investigated. She didn't know that Cooke had been into her bedroom until 30 years later. Now, Cooke must have felt invincible at this point. A feeling of power overwhelmed him, and it was only a month after this that his next hit and run was committed. On Boxing Day 1958, he stole a ute from the suburb of Como and drove a short distance to the nearby suburb of Belmont, when he saw a woman, 30-year-old Kathy Bellis, walking home. Kathy had just finished her shift at a local cafe and had taken the bus home. She had expected her husband Phil to be waiting for her in their green van, but her bus had been running quite late, so she assumed Phil had gone home, not wanting to leave their 2 small children home alone for too long. It was only a couple of blocks from her house, so she decided just to walk. She heard a car come up behind her and she turned, hoping to see Phil coming back to check if she'd arrived. But it wasn't their green van, it was the ute. She moved onto the path on the side of the road, but she heard the vehicle accelerate and hop the curb. This scared her, and she quickly moved into a neighbouring paddock, afraid that the vehicle and the driver had just lost control. She knew something was wrong when the ute sped up even more, crashing into the paddock and started following her. She broke into a run, but the car was faster. It struck her at high speed and she was thrown 20 metres and fell on the ground in agony. She heard the driver exit the vehicle and she begged him not to leave her there to die, but all she heard was the sound of him laughing at her. He then fled. It was dark and she hadn't seen his face. Kathy was lucky to survive. She suffered injuries all over her body, but she made a full recovery. The ute was found abandoned the next day, and when her husband and neighbours were ruled out as suspects, the case went cold. Cooke had once again gotten away with attempted murder. His attacks were growing in viciousness, and it seemed like attempted murder was not going to be enough to satisfy his need for violence. It was on the 30th of January 1959, only just over a month later, that he would kill his first victim. The previous day, Sally had given birth to their 5th child, and Cooke had visited her in the hospital. Another baby was cause for celebration, so he went to the local pub and drank. It was after midnight when he left, and he started roaming the streets looking for a potential victim. He had found a knife on the way, and he walked until he came across the City View apartments. There, he found an open window in a ground floor apartment. At 2:30 in the morning, he entered the bedroom of Patricia Vinico Berkman, or Penina. Penina Berkman was 33, worked at the cosmetics counter for a large retail outlet, and had 1 son. She was also divorced. She'd spent the evening with her boyfriend, a local radio announcer, Fotis Huntus, a Greek immigrant and somewhat of a minor celebrity. But it was a scandal. An unmarried woman entertaining a man in her apartment late at night was just not done in that time. Fotis had left earlier that evening and Penina had gone to bed. She was sleeping peacefully when Eric Edgar Cooke entered her room. Penina's son had fortunately been staying with some family friends that night, so wasn't there to witness the attack on his mother. As with Molly McLeod, Penina had heard someone rummaging in her room, and she'd woken to see a figure standing over her to the side of the bed. This time, though, Cooke was armed. He immediately attacked Penina with the knife, stabbing her through the face, neck, and chest. Penina fought, and fought hard. She clawed at him with her nails, gouging his face with deep scratch marks, but the wounds he'd inflicted were brutal, and she soon collapsed. As Cooke left the flat, Penina was still alive, and she attempted to drag herself out of their house for help before succumbing to her injuries and passing away alone in the middle of the night. The next morning, Fotis Huntus was walking to Penina's home when he noticed the windows and doors not just unlocked but wide open, which was odd. He went inside and found his girlfriend lying motionless in the living room, multiple stab wounds and dried blood covering her body. The immediate thought to authorities is that Fotis had done this to his girlfriend. He was an immigrant, and even though he had a high-profile career, this made him suspect number 1 to police in a town that at that time was struggling to accept diversity. Fotis was devastated, not only at the loss of Penina, but also at the fact that anyone thought he could do this to her. Suspicion of him only grew, though, when he boarded a plane back to Greece shortly after the murder. The police were sure that Fotis had done it, and him running made them even more confident of his guilt. They had no proof, but the community trusted the police. If the police said he did it, then he did it. There was no doubt that the police knew what they were doing. They were there to protect the community, and the community, in turn, trusted them implicitly. The city of Perth were reeling at this brutal slaying. This kind of thing just didn't happen. Sure, some theft and break-ins, but not murder. Cooke had left no fingerprints, no evidence, and DNA testing was not advanced enough to do anything with the blood and skin found under Penina's fingernails. The case went cold, but the police had assured the township that the culprit was Mr. Huntus, even though witnesses had seen him leaving the flat on the night in question before the murder, and had also reported seeing a man lurking in the neighbourhood on the nights before the attack. But no one could give a description of this man, so that lead went nowhere. The town of Perth didn't question it, and Huntus was marked as a murderer. And as long as Cooke didn't draw any attention to himself, he'd be in the clear. He told people that one of his sons, who'd been born with an intellectual disability, had lashed out and scratched his face, and that was that. He kept a low profile for over 6 months until his violent urges once again overwhelmed him. On the 8th of August 1959, he travelled to the suburb of Nedlands, and he entered an unlocked window and found 17-year-old Alex Duncan asleep in her bed. He started rummaging in her drawers and cupboards to find things to steal, and he hadn't been bothering to be quiet about it. The noises had woken Alex, and as she stirred, he attacked her with a blow to the head, and he ran. And Alex, still half asleep and with a painful head injury, hadn't seen him. She too, like Nell Schneider, would suffer from seizures for the rest of her life. By December 1959, Cooke was regularly lurking in the suburb of Brookwood. It was affluent and wealthy, and he relished in the power trip that came from knowing that he could make society pay for the treatment he'd received as a child. He was raised in South Perth, and he felt like the wealthy western suburbs residents looked down on him. He would take his revenge on a society that had rejected him, on those that had been treated better than he had been. At an apartment building in Brookwood Flats belonging to Betty Johnson, he had stolen a key from the ground floor apartment, and he'd regularly gone back to steal from that house. On these occasions, he'd caught sight of her next-door neighbour, who also happened to be her daughter, 22-year-old Jillian Brewer. Now, Jillian was the heiress to the McRobertsons Chocolate Company, which produced Australian classics like Freddo Frogs and Snack Bar and Old Gold and Cherry Ripe, and the company was later sold to Cadbury. Cooke had watched Jillian through her window a few times, but on the night of the 19th of December, he decided to enter her ground floor apartment. Earlier that evening, he had stopped by a garage that he'd cased a few days before and picked up what would be his murder weapon. A tomahawk. He entered Jillian's apartment and stood over the sleeping woman. He swung the hatchet and brought it down on her. He struck her 12 to 13 times with the weapon. He was frenzied. He hacked at her on the thighs, the stomach, the head, the throat. He almost completely severed her windpipe. He then went on to mutilate her genitals with the small axe. It was reported that he liked to watch her having sex with her fiancé, and she was a very pretty and wealthy young woman, so it was speculated that he was jealous at the love and the affection that was freely given to her partner that had never been given to him. He had struck her with so much force that the handle of the axe had split in the process. But Cooke wasn't finished with Jillian Brewer. He left the bedroom and entered the kitchen, where he found a pair of scissors. He went back to the bedroom, to Jillian's lifeless body, and stabbed her in the breast and chest 5 more times, before posing her body to look like it was sleeping. He cleaned and abandoned the scissors on the kitchen table, and as he crept out of the apartment, he threw the small axe over the back fence. And then he went home. Jillian's body was discovered the next day. Her dog, a French poodle named Christian Dior, was cowering under her bed, and she was lying in it, mutilated and brutalized. There were very few leads. Her family and fiancé were quickly ruled out as suspects, and the local boy who mowed their lawn, John Button, was questioned but ultimately also ruled out as a suspect. Eric Edgar Cooke and his wife Sally were home on the 21st of December, the day after Jillian was found. Sally recalls it was about 10 a.m. and Eric was reading the paper in bed. He called her in and pointed at the front page story about the discovery of Jillian's body, and she'd said, "How dreadful, another murder." Her husband replied, "Yes," and then he said to her, "Now, with the record I've got." She said yes. He said, "Well, if anyone comes checking up, would you please tell them that I was home early and that we spent the night with relatives, because with my record, they won't be fussy, they'll pin it on me." It turned out the police did come to ask Cooke about his whereabouts on the night of Jillian's murder. The police knew Cooke. They even affectionately called him Cookie. They had picked him up for many offences, including peeping Tom charges, and they had thought there'd been a sexual aspect to Jillian's murder, so they went through the list of sexual offenders in the surrounding areas, and decided to go and ask young Cookie some questions. While they were talking to him, his wife came through the door and said that he'd been home, and she knew that he'd been home all night because he got up to feed the baby at about 1 a.m. Sally was doing what her husband had asked her. She knew he was a thief, and she thought that the police were just doing exactly what her husband said they would, grasping at straws because of his previous record to try and pin it on him. She gave him the alibi he needed, and she was also probably really scared. I mean, he was violent and abusive towards her, and she was doing what he had ordered her to do. But they ruled Cookie out as a suspect. They continued investigating the known sexual offenders in the area, and 4 months later, on the 7th of April 1960, they picked up a 19-year-old man called Darryl Raymond Beamish. He'd been previously arrested for petty theft and child molestation. He fit the bill. He had prior sexual offences, and he had told police that, yes, he'd been to the Brookwood flats before. He'd walked a girl home to those flats once, and he also lived within walking distance of Jillian's apartment. The head detective, Owen Leach, arrested Darryl for murder, and he was taken to the station for interrogation. After a lengthy interview, Beamish had given a written confession to the murder. He could only give a written confession because he was both deaf and mute. When the papers released the information about the arrest and the confession, Perth residents breathed a small sigh of relief. Someone was finally being held accountable for the brutal slaying of socialite Jillian Brewer. The pathologist in the Brewer case, though, released findings that he saw particular similarities between the Penina Berkman case and the Jillian Brewer case. Both women had been stabbed to death in their ground floor flats in the middle of the night when someone had snuck in through open windows. Could a single person have committed both crimes? The police adamantly denied this, though. After all, they had already confirmed that Penina's boyfriend, Fotis Huntus, was the perpetrator in the Berkman murder, and of course, they had Darryl Beamish's written confession to the Brewer case. Now, we know now it was Eric Cooke, so why would an innocent young man sign a written confession to say that he'd committed this awful crime? Well, I'll come back to that, but be warned, it's going to make you want to throw something out a window. Beamish was convicted of Jillian Brewer's murder, and after a 6-day trial, he was sentenced to death, which was later commuted to life in prison, and he would end up serving 15 years in prison before being released. No one in the community at the time knew of Eric Edgar Cooke or suspected him of any wrongdoing. He'd been completely ruled out as a suspect for the Brewer case, and he was never suspected of having anything to do with Penina Berkman's murder. As a quick side note, Owen Leach, based on the arrest and conviction of Beamish, was promoted to police commissioner. Only 2 days after Beamish was arrested for Jillian Brewer's murder, on the 9th of April, Cooke was back out on the prowl, looking for another victim. He'd stolen a Holden sedan and was driving it around Perth when he saw 20-year-old Glynis Peake walking home alone at night. Glynis heard the car accelerate behind her and she turned to look, and she knew it was coming for her. She actually saw it move to line her up, and she started to run. The car hit her at speed from behind and she was seriously injured, and as she lay there, Cooke got out of the car, ran over, stole her purse and got back in the vehicle. He then abandoned the car in a nearby street and ran for it. Glynis managed to drag herself across the path into a lumber yard nearby and then through that yard to her parents' home. Cooke again had gotten away with another attack. He was developing an identifiable MO for these hit and runs, but no one seemed to be picking up on the fact that it was the same person committing all of these violent, horrible crimes. In May, on Friday the 13th, Cooke stole a Morris Minor in Belmont. He saw 18-year-old Jill Connell walking home from her shift at a local cafe. This time he sped past her, giving her a fright, just missing her. Jill was in shock, but it got worse a moment later when he turned the car around and came back towards her, gaining speed. He hit Jill head-on. Her body was thrown up and into the windscreen and she landed on the nature strip next to the road in a dirt patch. Cooke tried to reverse the car, perhaps to run her down again and actually kill the girl, but the car got bogged in the dirt and Cooke ran, leaving Jill alone in the dark with a broken leg and blood pouring from her head. She lay there for what seemed to her like forever until neighbours heard her cries and came to help. She was rushed to hospital. Jill recovered physically, but the emotional and mental damage lasted a lifetime, just as it would have done for every woman that Cooke had so far attacked. Only a week later, on the 20th of May, Cooke struck again. He had stolen another vehicle, and this time he'd spotted a group of 3 women walking home from the train station. He sped up and tried to take out all 3 of them at once. He managed to hit 18-year-old Georgina Pittman and 16-year-old Maureen Rogers. Maureen's 12-year-old cousin Tyrese was not hit, and she knew that if she didn't run, he'd come back for her. She ran for help and the other 2 girls survived the attack. The local press was now seeing a pattern. There had been a few hit and runs reported, but no details about the driver were ever able to be given. It was always dark, and he was always in a different vehicle. No one had seen his face or knew what he sounded like except for laughter. Cooke decided to calm down on the hit and run attacks, but continued to break into houses and steal what he could. It was almost 2 years later that Cooke returned to his vicious attacks on sleeping women. On the 3rd of March 1962, he broke into 23-year-old Anne Melvin's apartment and gained entry through the unlocked back door. He crept into her bedroom where Anne was sleeping. Anne awoke to find a stranger strangling her with a towel. She struggled, but she was already losing consciousness. She passed out and Cooke used her own stockings to tie her hands and arms to the bed frame. He then began removing her pants, but he was distracted by a loud noise nearby and he went to investigate, and Anne came around. She quickly realized the enormity of her situation and she screamed as loud as she could. Cooke once again took off. She managed to free herself, but Cooke had gotten away. It was another 9 months before he tried again. On the 29th of December, he snuck into the apartment of Peggy Belleville. She was sleeping alone, and as with Anne Melvin's, she awoke to him trying to remove her clothing. Peggy screamed and punched at her attacker, and Cooke struck her in the head, most likely with the torch that he'd regularly carried on his nighttime raids. He thought this would silence Peggy, but she kept on screaming, and once again this scared him and he ran into the night. Peggy would spend 4 days in hospital for her wounds, but would make a full recovery, physically at least. These attacks on women in their beds and burglaries were being reported every few months, and the Perth suburbs were running rampant with rumours that a gang of peeping toms were operating in the city. But it was just one very busy and very disturbed man. By January of 1963, Eric Edgar Cooke had killed 2 women by attacking them in their sleep and had attacked numerous others in the same manner. He'd committed multiple hit-and-run attacks on women walking alone and had broken into hundreds of houses around Perth to steal money and belongings, sometimes destroying the furniture and property, and other times setting the houses alight. But on the evening of January 26th, Australia Day, he would ramp up his violence in a way that no one in the city thought was possible. Cooke travelled to the suburb of Como, and there he found a .22 caliber rifle in a home that he'd crept into. He took it along with a box of ammunition. He stole a Holden sedan and drove with the firearm and ammunition to the seaside suburb of Cottesloe. He parked the vehicle and then began prowling in the suburb on foot, looking for potential victims. It was about 2 a.m. on the morning of the 27th, not far from where he'd parked the car, that he came upon a couple drinking beer in their parked car. The couple were Rowena Reeves, a barmaid at the local Ocean Beach Hotel, and Nicholas August, a local butcher shop owner. The couple started kissing, and Cooke took the opportunity to watch them for a while. But Rowena noticed him and pointed him out to Nicholas. They shouted at the strange man in the dark to go away, and Nicholas even threw a beer bottle at him. And that's when Cooke raised the gun. Rowena, who had seen it first, instinctively pushed Nicholas's head down as Cooke pulled the trigger. The bullet narrowly missed Nicholas's head but grazed the back of his neck before lodging in Rowena's wrist, shattering it. They did not wait around for the man to shoot again. Nick sped off, and in Cooke's later testimony he said that he walked to the spot the car had been parked and he looked at the back of the car that was hurriedly driving away while he took a few more shots at it and laughed. He said he didn't know why it was funny. It just was. He wasn't satisfied. He'd gone out to kill and his victims had gotten away. He walked a short way onto Broome Street where he saw an unlocked and open door. It was late January, the hottest part of the year, and a lot of Perth's residents routinely left windows and doors open to hopefully get a breeze or to let out hot air from inside. He entered the apartment and he came upon 31-year-old Brian Weir sleeping in his bed. Brian was a star athlete and volunteered at the surf club as a lifesaver. He even had 2 alarm clocks next to his bed to make sure that he got up in time to set up the flags and patrol the beaches. He was engaged to be married in just a few months. But Cooke didn't care about who Brian was. He said in testimony that he never really considered this man a person. He just pointed the gun right at Brian's head and pulled the trigger. Now, Brian would actually survive this attack, but would be left permanently disabled, blind in one eye, half of his entire body paralyzed, and extreme speech difficulties. And as a direct result of the injuries, he would pass away not 2 years later. While Brian was slowly bleeding out, Cooke stole another car and headed to the nearby suburb of Nedlands. He had still not satisfied his violent urges and was still looking for more victims. He came upon a boarding house on Vincent Street owned by Colleen Allen. She gave room and board to local uni students, and Cooke saw 19-year-old John Lindsay Sturkey sleeping on the veranda, which was common during the summer months. John and a friend had actually tossed a coin earlier that evening to see who would get to sleep outside where it was much cooler. Cooke walked up to John and pointed the rifle at his head. John turned in his sleep and was now facing Cooke, but that didn't stop Cooke from firing point blank at John's head. The shot killed him instantly. Cooke ran through the gate in the back fence onto Louise Street. John Sturkey had been the first male victim that Cooke ever had, but it wasn't his last. The next victim was George Ormond Wormsley, and in a change of pace from breaking into open windows, Cooke chose a house at random and he rang the doorbell. He then ran a few steps away and hid at the corner of the house's garage. George Wormsley was curious as to who could be ringing his doorbell at 4 a.m, and he went to open the door. He couldn't see anyone, so he took a few steps out of his house. Cooke took aim and shot George in the head from where he was waiting. Cooke said that at this point, after he'd shot George Wormsley, that the urge to kill had just left him, so he started walking back home, using the bridge across the river. He had thrown the rifle off the bridge on the way. In only 2 hours, Cooke had shot 5 people and killed 2 of them, and then he had gone home to his wife and 7 children. In the aftermath of these attacks, the detectives had almost nothing to go on. Cooke was now always wearing gloves, so there were no fingerprints. The only thing they did know is that all of the victims were shot with the same gun, which means it was one person committing all of these murders and attempted murders, which means they had a vicious killer among them. Perth was in a state of complete lockdown. Residents were installing deadbolts on their doors, they were installing bars on their windows, they were even going out and buying guard dogs, and no one slept on their back veranda anymore. It also caused a lot of residents to install toilets inside, because a lot of Perth at that time was still using outhouses. No one would answer their doors, and some families had created a password or call and answer system to ensure that they knew who was coming into their home. Even Cooke, to further remove suspicion, created a code with his wife and family. They would have to whistle a certain tune or knock in a certain pattern before they were allowed to come inside the house. The streetlights that were usually extinguished at around 1 a.m. were now left on all through the night and until the sun came up. In a massive task, police started rounding up all of the registered rifles in Western Australia, and more than 60,000 of them were tested against ballistics evidence, but it turned up nothing. Rewards offered for information led to hundreds of calls being made to the hotline, but all of them led nowhere, and Eric Edgar Cooke was never the subject of any of them. It seemed as if Cooke would get away with these murders too, and it wasn't long before the urge to kill came back. On February 9th, 1963, Eric Edgar Cooke stole an E.J. Holden sedan from outside a home and drove around Perth. He came across Rosemary Anderson, a 17-year-old girl, walking home alone in the evening in Shenton Park. He ran Rosemary down, crashing into her at high speed, and she was thrown up onto the bonnet of the car, hit the sun visor, and stayed there for a few meters until she was thrown onto the side of the road into the sand, bleeding and severely injured. He drove the car to Kings Park, but because of the damage to his vehicle from the way that he'd hit Rosemary, he intentionally crashed the car into a tree at the park to disguise any of the damage that had been caused by the hit and run. He then left the car there and escaped on foot. Rosemary had been spending time with her boyfriend John Button, who incidentally was the boy who mowed the lawns at Jillian Brewer's apartment building. The two were deeply in love and they had planned to marry, but they were waiting for Rosemary to turn 18 before they got officially engaged. John adored Rosemary, and he still does. They'd had an argument that night though, and Rosemary, in a fit of anger, had decided to walk home, and she had left his house. John had left in his car shortly after, not liking the thought of Rosemary walking home alone at night. He'd driven up next to her and begged her to get back in the car, but she refused. She was angry and she needed the walk to try and calm down. John figured she needed a few minutes, so he parked the car and watched her walk under the train overpass. He smoked a cigarette, thinking that the time it took to do that might be enough time for her to cool off a bit. He finished the smoke, got back into the car, and drove off the way he'd seen Rosemary walk. It was in these few minutes that Eric Edgar Cooke had run down the poor 17-year-old girl, and when John Button drove down the street that she'd been walking down, he saw her on the side of the road, bleeding and lifeless. She was alive, but barely. John immediately lifted Rosemary up under the arms, struggling with the dead weight, and dragged her back to his car, and then without a second thought drove her straight to the hospital, knowing that he didn't have long before it would be too late. He held on to hope that she would be okay. He knew she'd lost a lot of blood because his hands were covered in it from dragging her to the car, but he hoped he'd gotten her to the hospital in time. It was John's 19th birthday, but the only thing he wished for is that Rosemary would be okay. The doctor called police and they came to take John's statement. They took John to the station and into an interrogation room so he could give his statement to Detective Sergeant Max Baker, who was overseeing the interview. In the meantime, his car, a Simca, was being inspected. Officer Trevor Condren found that there was damage to the bonnet and left-hand side of the grille and the left headlight. This told investigators all they needed to know. John Button had done this to his own girlfriend. Maybe the argument had enraged him, and when he saw her walking, he was angry enough to hit her. Maybe he'd just been trying to scare her by pretending to hit her, but had accidentally driven too close and he'd actually run her over. John was denying everything. He didn't do this. He loved Rosemary and he would never do anything to hurt her. The damage to his vehicle had been caused by a small accident with another car, and he'd reported that incident 3 weeks ago. But detectives weren't buying it. The questioning went on, and after 24 hours in police custody, John asked after Rosemary. The detectives told him that she died a few hours earlier, and John was broken. He was devastated, and he no longer cared what happened to himself. After a few more hours, John gave a verbal and written confession to the running down and murder of the love of his life. John Button was charged with murder and was eventually convicted of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 10 years prison and hard labour. The jury had actually only deliberated for 3.5 hours, and when the foreman announced the verdict, he actually said not guilty. John let out an enormous sigh of relief until the foreman announced, "Sorry, I made a mistake there," and was asked to reread the verdict. It was guilty. John went on to serve 5 years before he was released, but his whole life had been taken away from him. His friends didn't want to know him. Rosemary's family thought he had killed her, and he was left with nothing. Now again, we know that Eric Edgar Cooke committed this crime, so why would another young, innocent man confess to it? Well, all will be revealed, and I did warn you that you're going to want to throw something out a window, so just wait for that. Cooke was back prowling the street on the night of the 15th of February and into the early morning hours of the 16th. 24-year-old Constance Lucy Madrill, known as Lucy, had left her back door propped open for her cat, and Cooke used it to enter her ground floor apartment. He was again looking for valuables to pick up, but once again Lucy had stirred at the sound of the strange man going through all of her possessions. Cooke hit her in the head and strangled her with his bare hands until she lost consciousness. Then he took the cord from her bedside lamp and strangled her to death. Eric Edgar Cooke, the Nightcaller, or the Monster of Nedlands, then proceeded to have sex with Lucy's dead body. When he had finished with this heinous act, he dragged the body out of the house to her yard, where he violated it again with a whiskey bottle this time. He then dragged her further through her backyard and into the yard of the property that backed onto hers. He positioned her body with the bottle under her arm and left. 13-year-old Rod Noble walked out of his back door later that morning to use the toilet. The Nobles still had an outhouse. Rod's mum had been behind him when they had opened the back door, and he saw the naked girl in the grass in his yard with the whiskey bottle under her arm. For a terrifying moment he thought it was one of his sisters, and his mother had rushed to check on her daughters. They were safe in bed. Rod stared at the body of the girl in his backyard. He knew her. It was Lucy from next door. They played backyard cricket in the laneway between the two houses, and Lucy often had to throw the ball back to Rod and his friends if they'd hit it over her back fence. Rod knew the moment that he saw the body that she was dead. The police were called, and investigators were horrified at what had been done to this poor woman. But because she had been strangled and assaulted in this particular manner, they never thought to connect it to any of the other crimes happening all around the city. Perth was held in a state of shock and horror about what was happening in their neighbourhood, and public opinion of the police was dropping at an alarming rate. They had Beamish locked away for life. They had John Button in custody awaiting trial, I mean, how many murderers and maniac killers could there possibly be? It seemed unbelievable to a lot of residents that there were more crazed killers within their own community. Cooke realised that he needed to lie low, again, and it was another 4 months before he crept into another unsuspecting woman's flat. On June 15, 1963, he squeezed into a tiny open window into 20-year-old Carmel Reed's flat. She woke at the flashing of light from his torch, and he grabbed the nearest thing he could, which was an umbrella, and jabbed her with it a few times. She moved, she got out of bed, she was on her feet, and she screamed and fought back, and that sent Cooke running. Cooke's break-ins and assaults had mainly been crimes of opportunity. He had planned to kill a few times, but a lot of the times it was just because he happened to have a weapon handy or had found one on his nighttime wanderings. It may have been this fact that saved Carmel's life, or it may have been the fact that she was alert and moving, up and about quickly, and most of his other victims had been completely unaware or in stages of sleep. 2 months later, on August 10, 1963, Cooke would strike again, committing his final murder. He had travelled into Cottesloe again and had snuck into a home where he'd found another .22 rifle. He picked it up and left the house to prowl around neighbouring suburbs. He ended up in Dalkeith, and while wandering around he saw an open garage door. He crept inside the house and came upon 18-year-old university student Shirley MacLeod studying in the living room. Her back was to him, and he took aim with the stolen rifle and fired a single shot, hitting Shirley in the head, killing her instantly. Shirley was at the home of Carl and Wendy Dowd, babysitting for their young son. She wasn't even their usual babysitter. A friend of hers that usually sat for the Dowds had fallen ill, so Shirley had agreed to go in her place. Shirley was still sitting on the lounge, pencil in hand, over her notebook, when Carl and Wendy arrived home at about 2 a.m. Carl immediately ran upstairs to check on the baby, afraid that the killer was still in the house. He ran into the baby's room and pressed his back to the door, terrified that he might find another body that night. But the baby was sleeping peacefully in his cot. Perth was now in a complete panic. No one was leaving their homes alone, no one was attending events, and babysitters across the city were refusing to work. During the investigation into Shirley's murder, police finally caught a break. They had found a single fingerprint that didn't belong to the Dowds or their friends or any of the officers or the tradesmen that the Dowds had recently had in their house. It was a stranger's print. It was the killer's print. The police started going door to door. They worked in 12-hour shifts, 24 hours a day, conducting the biggest mass fingerprinting in Australian history. In the first week of the operation, they had fingerprinted over 8,000 residents. Every male over the age of 12 across 5 suburbs was due to be fingerprinted, but they'd not come up with any matches. At the time, fingerprinting was done manually. They literally had to sit there with the 2 fingerprints in front of them and match different points. So they hadn't gone back through the records of fingerprinting, else they may have caught Eric Cooke a lot earlier. Now, at this point, they had another breakthrough in the case, and it would be Eric Edgar Cooke's downfall. 20 minutes away from Dalkeith, in the suburb of Mount Pleasant, Lila Keener and her husband, an older couple, were walking home, when Lila spotted a flowering Geraldton wax bush. She wanted to take some cuttings to plant in her own yard, so she walked up to the plant, and when she did, she noticed a gun lying underneath it. It was a .22 caliber rifle. Lila and her husband had seen the news and the reports of both the Australia Day shootings and the murder of Shirley MacLeod, the attacks carried out with the same caliber rifle, and they didn't think it was a coincidence that this one had been stashed under a bush less than 20 minutes from the latest crime scene. Lila immediately contacted the police, and the ballistics team came to collect the rifle. They tested the gun against the bullet that they had retrieved from Shirley's body. It was a match. This was the weapon that had killed her, and now they just had to find the person who had pulled its trigger. A trap was being set for Cooke. They replaced the gun with a decommissioned copy, and they had tied it to the bush with fishing line. They set up a camouflage tent further down the road, and they waited. They even held a meeting with the local media to tell them about the trap. The newspapers and television and radio stations had free will to report anything that might make the perpetrator want to go back for the gun. The media outlets hinted at Mount Pleasant being the next suburb to be searched and fingerprinted. And sure enough, after 17 days and 17 nights, a car pulled up and stopped near the wax bush. The police waited. They needed whoever it was to actually get out and go towards the rifle to pick it up, hence why they'd replaced it with one that didn't work. Officer Bill Hawker watched the man exit the vehicle, look around to make sure no one was watching him, and head straight for the bush and the rifle. They had him. Officers rushed out from their hiding places and pounced on Eric Edgar Cooke. They took him to the police station, where he promptly denied the murder of Shirley MacLeod. He told them that he'd stopped by near that bush to urinate a few days ago, and he'd seen the gun, and he just thought that, he'd go ahead and pick it up for fun. But police had been watching the site for over 2 weeks. They'd actually seen the vehicle that Cooke was driving come past before, but it had never stopped, and he'd never gotten out of it, so they knew he was lying. And this time they could prove it. They'd found a .22 caliber casing in Cooke's car, and they'd matched it to the MacLeod shooting. They had their man. His guilt was further confirmed when his wife Sally told detectives that Cooke had not been home the night of Shirley MacLeod's murder. She had lied and covered for her husband once, but not this time. When presented with this evidence, Cooke admitted to Shirley's murder. While in custody, they brought Sally to visit with him, and she didn't believe it at first, but she asked her husband outright, and he freely admitted that yes, it had been him. He had done it. And then in front of his wife, he told police, "You're lucky you caught me without me realizing I was being caught, because I had enough bullets and a rifle in my roof at home to do away with my family and myself." When the police asked incredulously if he would do away with his own little children, Cooke said, "Well, I wasn't going to leave them behind for anybody else." Police suspected that Cooke was also behind the Australia Day shootings. Detective Sergeant Max Baker drove him around Perth to the locations of the other shootings, but he only confessed to minor crimes: peeping Tom crimes, stealing cars, break-ins, and minor theft. His memory for his crimes was regarded as incredible. He knew down to the scents that he'd taken from each place, what kind of dogs they had, the descriptions of the liquor bottles that he'd drunk from. But they needed a confession. They needed something. So they stopped at a hotel after driving around a while and bought him some dinner. Baker there told him that he would hang for Shirley's murder, and then asked him, would he be dragged to the gallows like a mongrel dog, or would he go like a man, to think of his family? This struck a chord with Cooke, and he said, "What do you want to know?" They asked him if he'd shot George Walmsley and the others on Australia Day 1963, and he said, "Yep, I'm the bloke you're looking for. Now what?" They then decided to drive him back around to all of the locations so that he could show them what had happened. He told them all about wandering from street to street, what positions his victims had been in, how he could hear their heavy and even breathing before he shot them, and he told them about throwing the rifle over the bridge into the river. His eidetic memory could even pinpoint where he had thrown it from: light pole number 324. Diving teams, now knowing exactly where to look, recovered the rifle from the lake, and ballistics confirmed it was the weapon used for the shootings back in January. For the first time since Penina's murder, the community of Perth finally felt real, actual relief, the sense that this maniac had finally been caught. But once Cooke started confessing, he didn't stop. He went on to confess to the murder of Lucy Madrill, and then to the murders of Penina Berkman and Jillian Brewer. But that couldn't be. The police were already convinced that Penina's boyfriend Fotis Huntus had been the perp in her murder, and they had Darryl Beamish locked away for life for Jillian's murder. And then Cooke confessed to the hit and run of Rosemary Anderson, the crime that John Button was serving 10 years for. They took Cooke to the street where Rosemary had been found, and he told them all about seeing her and getting violent urges. He told them about running her down, about how she'd stayed on the car for a while, and how she'd fallen off the hood of the car. But the place that he pointed to was a few meters off where her body had been found by John Button. He told them about intentionally crashing the car into a tree at Kings Park to cover up the damage. The police remembered finding the abandoned vehicle, but the tree Cooke had pointed out was about 4 trees away from where they had found the car back in February. So the police decided that he was lying, probably to delay the investigation and fight for time before he'd be taken to court. The punishment for murder in the 60s in Australia was death, so the police were confident that he was trying to delay his own execution by taking them on a wild goose chase. They again ruled Cooke out for the murder of Rosemary Anderson because of a couple of meters and 4 trees. Baker even said to him, "You didn't do this one, Cookie, we know you didn't." And they refused to believe that Cooke was telling the truth about Rosemary or Jillian. They told him to retract his confession to their murders. So he did. It would certainly have looked bad if a man was caught for the murders that police had already sent 2 other men to prison for. And besides, Darryl Beamish and John Button had confessed, so they must have done it, right? John Button, in the meantime, had actually heard that Cooke had confessed to murdering Rosemary, and he finally felt like he might be free, that the truth had finally come out, and he waited for someone to come and open his prison cell and say sorry and let him out. But no one ever came, and he found out later that Cooke had retracted the confession. Now, because of Cooke's physical deformities, the press and the community wondered whether it was some sort of inferiority complex that had motivated him to commit these heinous crimes. He had gone over to the upper-class suburbs of Nedlands and Cottesloe to commit most of his murders, which was considered the posh or snobby part of town at that time, and that's not my opinion. The residents of the western suburbs said it themselves. They were looked on as if they were better than their neighbours across the river in South Perth. Cooke was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. In the lead-up to Cooke's trial, he was assessed by numerous psychological professionals. Dr. Aaron Samuel Ellis determined that Cooke seemed totally deficient in emotion. He expressed and felt no remorse for his actions and could not see others as people with rights or feelings. Dr. Ellis did confirm, though, that Cooke was perfectly fit to stand trial. Dr. Leon Blank also visited with Cooke in prison while awaiting trial, and he reported that Cooke was of normal intelligence but had psychopathic character disorders. He noted that Cooke also seemed curious about his own actions and struggled to understand why he had done the things that he did. Cooke's defence team, of course, had their own psychological expert who testified that Cooke suffered from schizophrenia, which could easily be mistaken for psychopathic character disorders. But the former was a recognised mental disease, and therefore the jury would have the option to find Cooke not guilty on the grounds of insanity. Christine Edgar, Cooke's mother, made a statement to the court in his defence, saying that whilst her husband had forbidden her to visit with Eric, she wished she could have done something for him. She said that she believed Eric had done what he did because he wanted to be a big shot, and she believed that he had shot those people because he just couldn't stop himself. She said that she believed he was just wanting to hit back at the world, and that she couldn't and wouldn't ever believe that her son was a deliberate killer. The jury only deliberated for just over an hour, and again, they had the option to find him not guilty by reason of insanity, but they decided that the evidence that Cooke was in complete control over his own faculties was overwhelming. They came back and delivered a guilty verdict. Cooke was sentenced to death by hanging. A little under a year after Cooke was sentenced on October 26, 1964, Eric Edgar Cooke was escorted to the gallows of the Fremantle prison. Reverend Ralph Thomas began performing his last rites when Cooke suddenly snatched the Bible out of the minister's hands. He called out to the crowd, "I swear before Almighty God that I did kill Rosemary Anderson and Jillian Brewer." Now, why he'd have any reason to lie at that point, I couldn't tell you, but the police still maintained that Cooke was a habitual liar, but mainly only about the murders of those two women. At 8 a.m, the trapdoor of the gallows opened and Cooke was hanged. He was the last man ever executed in Western Australia. 28 years later. Almost 30 years later, an amazing investigative journalist named Estelle Blackburn was at a dance when she met Jim Button, John Button's brother, in November of 1991. Jim told Estelle about his brother, how he'd been convicted and jailed for the murder of his girlfriend when another man, a serial killer, had confessed to it. Estelle didn't believe Jim at first. She believed in the Australian justice system and in the police force, but she was a journalist, so she couldn't just leave it at that. She had to hear what John had to say. She met with John in early 1992 and heard his story, and she was hooked. She knew she needed to find out more. She had connections in government from being a press secretary and from her previous job as the media advisor to the Minister for Police and Local Government. Estelle was able to access all of the police files for John Button and Eric Edgar Cooke, and what she found was astonishing. She found pages and pages, boxes even, of confessions that Cooke had made that police had not made public. Confessions of numerous hit and runs that Cooke had committed, confessions of break-ins and assaults on young women. They had all been suppressed and kept archived and never revealed to the public or at trial, because they showed that Cooke had an MO. It showed that he had run down so many women in the same way that Rosemary Anderson had been run down, and it proved that Eric Edgar Cooke had committed the same offences before and after Rosemary's death. It indicated that the police had convicted the wrong man, and they knew it. Estelle then began to interview the police, and she had a very enlightening interview with Detective Sergeant Max Baker, the same Max Baker that had overseen the interrogation with John Button. He told her, "Well, things happen you wouldn't read about. You might persuade the fellow with a few rib ticklers or punches to the stomach. Such as that would be far better if they told the truth, and I suppose that's where you went out of bounds." He told Estelle this while laughing. When interviewed much later in the After the Night documentary, he revealed that he had sent many people to prison on the basis of just a hunch, and when you really felt like the guy you had was the guy that had done it, you just kept going. You just have go after go after go after go until they confess. John Button, in his 1963 interrogation, had claimed that while in the locked room with no witnesses, no lawyers, no parents, no video or audio recording, that he was physically assaulted by police until he confessed to a crime he did not commit. After the interview with Baker, Estelle knew that John's confession was coerced, and the police knew they were convicting an innocent man. In 1998, Estelle Blackburn released her book Broken Lives, which outlined the crimes and confessions of Cooke and the numerous appeals processes that both John Button and Darryl Beamish had gone through. In 2002, John Button finally received approval for a new appeal. He had lodged many over the last 20 years, but all had been rejected on the basis that not enough new evidence was presented. Estelle Blackburn, with the help of Brett Christian, who owns the Post newspaper, along with countless volunteers, put together a plan. They were going to create some tests to see if the damage to John's car could possibly have been caused by the accident that killed Rosemary Anderson. Brett Christian had contacted a crash test expert from America, Rusty Haight, and had paid his way to Australia to set up the tests. They located a couple of the same make and model of car that John Button had been driving, and they also procured the same model Holden that Eric Edgar Cooke had said he was driving when he ran down Rosemary. Now, the police had initially claimed that there was no way that her body could have hit the Holden sun visor without breaking it clean off, and the judge had agreed, which had confirmed to them at the time that Cooke was not responsible. But the tests that this group did proved that the sun visor would not only have just popped back into place, but the damage inflicted to the vehicle would have been huge compared to the minor dents that were found in John Button's front left bonnet and headlight. In John's final appeal in 2002, his conviction was overturned and he was finally exonerated. It had been almost 40 years since he had been convicted and he was finally proven innocent. Now, I watched the footage of the conviction being overturned and I cried like a baby. You actually feel the relief that John felt when the verdict was given that there had been a major miscarriage of justice, and he finally felt like he was free. Now, it took another 3 years to clear the name of Darryl Beamish, and if you thought that what happened to John Button wanted to make you throw something out a window, just wait. Estelle was finding that the corruption within the police force was systemic. Darryl Beamish was a 19-year-old deaf and mute man with the reading, writing and verbal comprehension of a 7-year-old at the time that he was arrested, charged and convicted of brutally murdering Jillian Brewer. When he was taken in for interrogation, he, like Button, had no lawyer, no parental guardian, police had their own interpreter, and of course there was no video or audio recording. Now it was finally revealed that detectives had asked Beamish to copy out words that they had written on a different piece of paper. And these words included yes, an axe, and I want to tell the truth. Detective Sergeant Owen Leach had forced Darryl Beamish to copy down these words on a written confession that had been prepared by police. And I don't mean forced as in strongly suggested that he do it. I mean forced as in had a hand on the back of Beamish's neck and Leach had Darryl's hand in his hand and forced him to copy the words down. When Darryl Beamish had signed frantically to the interpreter that he didn't do this, he hadn't murdered anyone, the interpreter didn't say a word. She had refused to speak for him and she'd kept her mouth shut. The police, and in particular Owen Leach, took advantage of a young disabled man to look good, to make it seem like they were doing their job. They condemned this man to death, knowing he was innocent of this crime. When Estelle found Cooke's confessions to numerous similar break-and-enters and attacks on young women, it was further proof that the police had acted in an appalling and despicable manner. And they knew that if the evidence of Cooke's other crimes ever got out, there would be questions asked about whether Beamish and Button had been guilty, which would, of course, make the force look bad. And remember what I said about Owen Leach earlier? He was promoted to police commissioner based primarily on this conviction. I mean, to the community, he was a hero. He'd caught a deranged killer. Even the former Premier of WA said that Owen Leach was a very difficult man to deal with and he would never admit to making a mistake. Fortunately now, interrogations are recorded and deaf suspects are actually entitled to 2 interpreters, one for them and one for the police. In 2004, Darryl Beamish had his 6th appeal attempt approved, and in 2005 he was officially proven innocent of the murder and exonerated of the crime that he had already spent 15 years in prison for. The Western Australian Police have still not offered a formal apology for their behaviour, and no one was ever held accountable for these actions. But some good did come out of the exonerations of both Button and Beamish. The Western Australian Royal Commission into Police Corruption was formed, and in its first week it heard evidence of corrupt police officers, stolen drugs, forged paperwork, missing evidence, and more. The investigation led to the exonerations of multiple innocent men, most notably the Mickelberg brothers, who were charged and convicted of stealing almost 70 kilograms of gold from the Perth Mint in 1982, and they spent over 15 years in prison between them. They were proven innocent during the Royal Commission when one of the arresting officers came forward and confessed that some of the evidence, including fingerprint evidence, had been totally fabricated by the police. Then there was Andrew Mallard, who was charged and convicted of the murder of jewellery shop owner Pamela Lawrence. The Royal Commission had revealed that evidence that would have exonerated Mallard was never admitted or ever given to the defence team, and that evidence pointing to another suspect was hidden and suppressed. The Royal Commission also led to the creation of the CCC, which is the Crime and Corruption Commission in Australia. Estelle Blackburn then took it upon herself to track down the victims of Eric Edgar Cooke, and told them what had happened to them and who had attacked them. Because his confessions were never released, they never knew it was him. She also spent years tracking down Penina Berkman's son Mark. Mark hadn't known for 40 years what officially had happened to his mother when she was brutally murdered by Cooke, and he was never told or informed by the police that they had caught the man who had done it. Eric Cooke's oldest son, Tony, became a social worker in the prison system. He didn't know how he'd be received because of his father's crimes, but he excelled in his work. He said in an interview that the impact of his father's actions were profound, and it only made his conviction stronger to be working towards a more positive society, which is why he chose the career that he did. He wanted to make sure that there was a positive voice for those in the prison system that needed help and guidance. He rose above the adversity and stigma surrounding his father, and he became a respected and well-loved politician. He became head of the unions WA and led major industrial reform and protests fighting for the working class. These protests ended in a rally marching to Parliament House, and Sally Cooke remembers that the government said he wouldn't get 3 people to attend. He got 350,000. Tony Cooke died on the 24th of April 2018 after a long battle with cancer, but he had ended the cycle of abuse, neglect and violence from the men in his family. Sally Cooke passed away on the 14th of October 2019. She remained a strong woman and an amazing mother to her children, and she was proud to say that not one of her children turned out like their father. And that, guys, is the case of Eric Edgar Cooke, the Nightcaller, or the Nedlands Monster, or my preferred nickname, Fuckity McFuckface. And thank sweet baby Jesus for Estelle Blackburn. She dedicated so much of her life to revealing the truth, and in the meantime she helped piece back together the lives of 2 men and their families and gave closure to so many others. I mean, she is the real hero. She's the real MVP. Well, I hope to see you guys on the next episode, but until then, be good, be kind and decent humans, and don't murder anyone. Bye.